MC called the White House secretary his secret relationship. Trump used power to sink her career. The lights above the studio flickered to life as the camera panned across the polished set of one of the most watched TV shows in America. The stage was set for yet another high-stakes interview that had the audience buzzing with anticipation. Today's guest wasn't just any politician. It was none other than Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, now a private citizen, but still a figure that drew attention wherever he went. The host, Whoopi Goldberg, sat at her desk, her eyes gleaming with that familiar, confident smirk that she had perfected over the years. She had built her career on being the sharp-tongued, no-nonsense personality who controlled every conversation she entered. She had been the anchor of The View for years, wielding her dominance like a shield. But today, something felt different. Today, it was her turn to face someone who wasn't going to back down. Trump sat across from her, his usual confidence evident in the way he leaned forward in his chair, his gaze unwavering. He was used to being in the spotlight, but he knew this interview could turn into a battleground. He was well aware of Whoopi's reputation for taking down her guests with a quick remark or a sharp question, but he wasn't going to let her take control of the narrative today. He had faced far worse in his political career, and this would be no different. He wasn't intimidated. He was ready. The audience was quiet, all eyes on the pair. The tension was palpable. Whoopi Goldberg was known for pushing boundaries with her tough questions, and Trump had already faced his fair share of difficult interviews. But today's discussion promised to be more explosive. Whoopi, with her usual directness, wasted no time. "So, Mr. Trump," she began, her voice smooth yet cutting, "you've been in the news a lot lately. From political scandals to, well, your relationship with Caroline Leavitt. Let's start with that. Can you explain what exactly is going on there?" The words hit Trump like a sharp jab, but his expression didn't falter. He was prepared for this. Whoopi had always been known for her bluntness, but he wasn't about to let her turn this into a circus. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, Whoopi," Trump said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "I've been very clear about my relationship with everyone in my life, but as usual, the media twists everything into something it's not." Whoopi leaned in, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't letting go that easily. She'd made her career by challenging the powerful, and Trump was as powerful as they came. "Oh, come on, Mr. Trump," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "We all know you've had your fair share of controversies, but Caroline Leavitt? Really? Are you saying there's nothing there? Because the rumors have been swirling, and I think it's time we set the record straight. How do you respond to those allegations?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. There was a hushed murmur as the words allegations and rumors hung in the air. Trump could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his legacy, his reputation, and how the world saw him. This was a battle for control of the narrative. He could feel the pressure mounting. Whoopi wasn't just asking questions, she was making accusations, stirring the pot. But Trump had been in this situation before. He knew how to handle it. "I've never been one to shy away from the truth," Trump said, leaning forward slightly. "But let's get something straight, Whoopi. You can't just throw out rumors and expect them to stick. Caroline Leavitt is a professional. She works hard. This is just another attempt to smear me, just like they've done with everyone else I've worked with." Whoopi smirked, clearly enjoying the back and forth. She wasn't backing down. "You can call it a smear campaign all you want, Mr. Trump," she replied. "But the reality is that people are talking. And those rumors aren't coming from nowhere. You've seen what the media's been saying. Your own people, like Melania, don't even seem to want to defend you on this one. How do you explain that?" Trump's jaw tightened, but his eyes never left Whoopi's. He wasn't about to let her bait him. He knew how to handle questions like these. He had faced far worse scrutiny during his time in office. What was happening now was just another attempt to discredit him. "Melania and I have a private relationship, Whoopi," Trump said, his voice firm, "and I'll leave it at that. What you and the media do, though, is twist the facts, make assumptions, and try to turn people against each other. But I'm not falling for it." Whoopi wasn't satisfied. She could sense that Trump was evading the real issue, dancing around the question without truly addressing it. That was her strength, getting people to reveal themselves, to show their true colors. And today, she wasn't about to let Trump off the hook. "Let's move on then," she said, still pressing. "You've had a lot to say about your opponents. About the White House press secretary, for example. You've criticized her publicly. But let's be honest here. Aren't you just taking shots because she's doing a better job than you ever did? Trump's eyes narrowed at the mention of the press secretary. That was a sore spot. But he wasn't going to let Whoopi twist the conversation. Let me tell you something, Whoopi, he said, his tone steely. The press secretary is just another example of how the media is failing the American people. She can't even answer simple questions without getting flustered. It's embarrassing. Whoopi's smile widened. She had clearly touched a nerve, and she wasn't about to let go. Well, Mr. Trump, she said, leaning in with that same provocative air. Maybe it's time you took a look in the mirror, because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you're just not able to handle the heat anymore. The tension in the studio thickened as Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair, eyes locked onto Trump with a mixture of curiosity and challenge. Her gaze was unflinching, her posture relaxed, but there was a sharpness to her tone that suggested she wasn't about to let him escape the heat. Trump, however, had faced much worse in his life, and this was no different. But there was something about this interview, the way Whoopi had framed every question, that made him feel the weight of every word. The lights shone brightly overhead, their glow reflecting off Trump's immaculately tailored suit. He remained cool, his expression composed, but his mind was calculating every word that left his mouth. Whoopi had a way of catching people off guard, of making them feel cornered, but he had prepared for this. The media, the critics, the relentless questions, they were all part of the game now. You know, Mr. Trump, Whoopi continued, her voice calm but biting. I've interviewed a lot of powerful people in my time. But you seem to have a particular way of dodging the tough questions. Why do you think that is? Do you have something to hide? Or is it just your style to deflect? Trump's lips curled into a tight smile, but his eyes remained cold. He knew Whoopi was trying to provoke him, to get under his skin, and she was good at it. Very good, but he wasn't going to fall into her trap. Whoopi, I'm not here to play games, he said, his tone sharp. I'm here to talk about the real issues facing this country. Not these, he gestured vaguely, referring to the rumors and innuendo swirling around his personal life, distractions. You know better than anyone that the media loves to sensationalize things. It's what they do best. The audience shifted in their seats, the air thick with anticipation. It was clear that Trump wasn't going to give in to Whoopi's provocations, but it was also evident that the stakes of this interview were much higher than a simple back and forth. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. So, no comment on the Levitt situation then? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You just want to skip over that and pretend like it doesn't exist? Trump's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. He wasn't going to let her control the narrative. You know, I've already addressed this. The rumors are just that, rumors. I'm not going to sit here and entertain every baseless claim made by the media. But Whoopi wasn't done. She wasn't letting go of this story so easily. It's not just the media, Mr. Trump, she pressed. It's people who are close to you, your own family, even. They're not exactly backing you up on this one, are they? Take Melania, for example. She's barely been seen with you lately. Does that not raise a few eyebrows? Trump's expression remained stoic, but internally, his frustration was mounting. Whoopi's words were like daggers, digging into his personal life in a way he wasn't used to on this kind of platform. His family had always been a source of strength for him, and to have his relationship with Melania scrutinized like this, it was a low blow. She's my wife, and I'll leave it at that, Trump replied firmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. I don't need to explain my personal relationships to you or anyone else. But Whoopi wasn't about to let the subject go. She leaned in closer, her voice quieter but no less forceful. But that's the problem, Mr. Trump. You've never wanted to explain yourself. You've always danced around the tough issues. The press secretary, your relationship with Levitt, Melania's silence, it all adds up, doesn't it? Or do you just expect the public to keep buying your excuses? Trump's fingers drummed lightly on the arm of his chair. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of Whoopi's questions pulling at him. But he was no stranger to being cornered. He had been through worse. He could handle this. I don't need to justify myself to anyone, Trump said with a steely edge to his voice. I've built an empire. I've led this country, and I've dealt with more than my fair share of media attacks. So, if you think you're going to break me down with a few questions, you're wrong. Whoopi's eyes sparkled with amusement, clearly enjoying the verbal sparring. She was used to guests getting defensive, But with Trump, it was different. He wasn't backing down, not in the slightest. And that intrigued her. Fair enough, she said, leaning back in her chair. But let's talk about the real issues then, Mr. Trump. Let's talk about what's happening in this country. You've been very vocal about your criticism of the current administration. You've called them incompetent, weak. But what would you do differently? What's your plan? Trump's demeanor shifted slightly, the frustration from earlier now replaced with a sense of focus. This was a question he could answer. He had been in the trenches of politics long enough to know how to pivot and redirect. He could talk about policies, about the future. That was his strength. What would I do differently? Trump repeated, leaning forward slightly. I'd start by securing our borders. I'd bring jobs back to this country. And I'd make sure that the American people are the ones getting the benefits of our economy, not the global elites. Whoopi listened intently, her eyes narrowed. And how do you plan to do all that? You've been critical, but what's your actual plan to fix things? It's easy to criticize, but what's the solution? Trump's smile returned, but this time, there was a touch of pride in it. The solution is simple. Put America first. I've done it before, and I'll do it again. We need to bring back manufacturing, cut taxes, and get rid of the bureaucratic red tape that's holding us back. We need to make America the powerhouse it once was. Whoopi didn't seem entirely convinced, but she nodded slowly. She had gotten him to talk about something concrete, something that wasn't just political rhetoric. She wasn't going to let him off the hook, though. Not yet. All right, Mr. Trump, she said, her voice steady. You've got a plan, but people are still asking why now? Why come back into the spotlight after everything that's happened? Trump leaned back in his chair, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. Because I believe in this country. And I believe that we need leadership that isn't afraid to stand up for the people. I'm here to do what's right, no matter what anyone says. Whoopi smiled, sensing the answer she had been looking for. But she knew she wasn't done yet. There were still plenty of questions left to ask, and she wasn't about to let him get away with just simple answers. She had one more question on her mind, something she knew would hit Trump where it hurt the most. Whoopi Goldberg sat back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest as she assessed Trump. There was a stillness in the room now, a momentary pause that hung in the air, almost like a prelude to the final blow. The audience was hanging on every word, the tension palpable. The bright studio lights illuminated the contours of Trump's face, but even under such scrutiny, he remained poised, his eyes focused and unyielding. But Whoopi wasn't about to let this interview end without pressing him just a little more. Mr. Trump, she began, her voice cutting through the silence with precision. You've spoken about your plans, about making America great again. But there's one thing I can't ignore, your past. Specifically, the way you've handled, she paused, emphasizing the words handled and dealt with your personal relationships. The rumors surrounding Caroline Leavitt, your wife's silence, and the way your administration dealt with questions of loyalty. It's hard not to draw parallels to your leadership. Trump's expression hardened. Though his voice remained controlled, he knew the question was coming. He had prepared for it, but that didn't make it any easier. Look, Whoopi, let's be clear, he said slowly, his tone a bit colder now. What I do in my personal life is my business. I've never hid from the public. What's important is what I've done for this country. I've been open about my policies, about my vision. The rest is just noise. Whoopi leaned in a little closer, her voice lowering to a near whisper. But the noise is louder than ever, Mr. Trump. And it's not just coming from the media. It's coming from people who are close to you. Your own family has been remarkably silent on a lot of issues lately, and the whispers about your affair with Leavitt haven't died down. Do you think it's right to ignore it? Trump's jaw clenched at the mention of Leavitt's name. His mind flashed back to the accusations, the endless scrutiny. His relationship with Caroline had been a lightning rod for the media, and now, sitting across from Whoopi, it felt like every question was an attempt to drive the knife in deeper. He took a deep breath, holding himself together. I've answered those questions already. I'm not going to keep revisiting them. If you want to discuss my policies, my leadership, I'm more than happy to. But I'm not going to let anyone use my personal life as a political weapon. Not now, not ever. Whoopi, sensing the tension building, didn't relent. She could see the cracks beginning to form, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Trump was a master of controlling his image, but even the best actors had their limits, and she intended to find them. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Trump," she said, her tone shifting slightly. "You have been incredibly transparent about your policies. But when it comes to accountability, when it comes to personal integrity, that's where the public is struggling to see the connection. How can you talk about loyalty, about trust, when those very qualities seem to be in question in your personal life?" There it was, the question he had been dreading. Trump felt a flicker of frustration, but quickly masked it with a practiced smile. He wasn't about to let Whoopi, or anyone else, dictate the narrative. "You think that just because I've had a few personal challenges, I'm somehow unfit to lead this country?" Trump shot back, his voice rising slightly. "This is about the American people, not about my personal life. I've delivered. I've made things happen, and my track record speaks for itself. If you want to focus on the past, fine, but I'm focused on the future." The room was tense, but Whoopi wasn't backing down. She had her own point to make, and this was her moment. "No one's questioning your ability to lead, Mr. Trump," she said coolly. "But it's hard for people to believe in your message of loyalty when they see you dodging the truth. It's hard to rally behind someone who doesn't seem willing to own up to their mistakes. If you want to bring people together, that's the first step." Trump's gaze darkened, but he didn't break. He was used to this kind of pressure, used to the media twisting things, trying to get him to react in a way that would create a scandal. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with it was to stand firm, to never let them see him sweat. "I own up to everything I've done. I'm not perfect, but I've never claimed to be. What matters is the job I've done, the difference I've made. And if that's not good enough for some people, that's their problem, not mine," he said, his voice growing more resolute with each word. Whoopi didn't let the moment slip by. She leaned forward again, her eyes never leaving his. "But don't you think, Mr. Trump, that a little transparency would go a long way in rebuilding trust with your base? Your critics may not be convinced, but the American people, your supporters, they need to hear it from you. They need to see the man they've been supporting, the leader they've put their faith in, owning up to his actions." Trump stared at her, the weight of the question hanging in the air. For a moment, it seemed like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for his response. The lights above buzzed softly, casting sharp shadows on his face, highlighting every inch of the strain beginning to show in his posture. "You think I'm not transparent?" he said finally, his voice quiet but tinged with a quiet fury. "I've given everything for this country. I've made sacrifices. I've been attacked. And I've kept going. What more do you want?" Whoopi leaned back again, her expression unreadable. She had pushed him as far as she could for now. The conversation had reached a crossroads, and she knew it. There were still a few more questions she wanted to ask, but they would have to wait. For now, she had gotten under his skin, and that was enough. The public was listening. The public was watching. And Trump had just shown them a side of himself that was rare, vulnerable, perhaps, but undeniably human. The room felt colder now, the atmosphere heavier. Trump's body language had shifted. Gone was the confident posture of the man who had walked in, the leader with an unwavering sense of control. He was still a towering figure, but there was a subtle tension in his shoulders, a slight tightness in his jaw, a flicker of something that he couldn't entirely mask. Whoopi noticed it immediately. Her question had hit its mark, and while he was trying to maintain his composure, there was something unspoken between them now, a mutual recognition that the interview was no longer about just politics. It was personal, too. The audience, ever watchful, seemed to pick up on the change. The hushed murmurs were like the low hum of a distant storm. It wasn't just a television show anymore. It had turned into something much bigger, a moment of reckoning, a confrontation that would be dissected across social media, in newsrooms, and living rooms for weeks to come. Trump took a deep breath and shifted in his seat, his eyes still locked on Whoopi. He knew this wasn't going to end with a neat, tidy conclusion, but he wasn't about to let her or anyone dictate the terms of the conversation. He needed to regain the narrative, and fast. "So, you want transparency, huh?" Trump said, his voice carefully controlled. "Well, let me tell you something. I've been more transparent than any other president. I've given this country everything I've got. What's more transparent than that?" Whoopi leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the desk in front of her, eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed him. "I think what people want, Mr. Trump, is to hear the truth. And not just when it's convenient for you, Your supporters want to believe in you, but you're making it harder for them. Every time you dodge these questions, you make it seem like there's something to hide. Trump's eyes flashed with annoyance, but he masked it with a smirk. He was no stranger to confrontation. And if there was one thing he'd learned in the years of battling the media, it was how to flip the script. Whoopi, I've never dodged a question in my life. I've answered every one of them, Trump replied, his voice rising just enough to carry weight. But some things aren't meant to be aired out in public. You think people need to know about my private life? You think it's going to change anything about what I've done for this country? Whoopi paused for a moment, then tilted her head slightly, the subtle shift of her posture emphasizing her next words. Yes, Mr. Trump, I do. Because you're asking for people's trust, their loyalty, and their belief. But trust is a two-way street. You can't expect to lead by keeping people in the dark about your actions. It's not just about politics anymore. It's about integrity. And without integrity, how can you expect anyone to believe in you? The silence that followed felt weighty, almost suffocating. Trump's eyes flicked to the side briefly, as if he were searching for a way out, but there was none. The question was simple, and yet it had the power to unravel everything he had built. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't deflect it, but he wasn't going to let it break him either. He cleared his throat, shifting his posture as he squared his shoulders. He was done with dancing around the issue. If Whoopi wanted an answer, she was going to get one. Fine, Trump said, his voice steady but carrying an underlying edge. I'll be honest with you. You want transparency. I'll give it to you. But let's make one thing clear. Whatever happens in my personal life is between me and my family. I've made mistakes, sure. Who hasn't? But I've never lied about what I stand for. And I've never lied to the American people. That's what matters. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She could see the shift in Trump, the flicker of vulnerability that momentarily overtook his bravado. This was the side of him the public rarely saw unshielded, unguarded. And yet, here we are, Whoopi responded softly, her voice almost contemplative. Still talking about your personal life, still trying to justify the choices you've made. Do you really think that's the best way to move forward? Trump's eyes narrowed, but he didn't look away. He was playing a different game now, one of his own making. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. I don't think this is about my personal life anymore, Whoopi, Trump said, his voice hardening with renewed conviction. This is about the future. This is about what's best for the country. And if you want to keep trying to make it about something else, that's your choice. But the American people know what's at stake. They know what I've done, and they know what I'll continue to do. That's all that matters. Whoopi nodded slowly, her gaze not leaving his. She had pressed him. She had gotten a response, and in some ways, that was all she needed. But there was still one more point to make, one last strike to land. And yet, Mr. Trump, she said, her tone quieter now. The questions remain. People will remember how you responded tonight. They'll remember what you said and what you didn't say. And when the time comes to decide, will they trust that you're the man for the job? Trump didn't respond immediately. For a brief, fleeting moment, he allowed himself to think about it. The public's trust, the loyalty of his base. But then, he pushed those thoughts aside. He had a bigger picture in mind. The game wasn't over. Not yet. The tension in the air was palpable. Trump sat back in his chair, his expression hardening once more as he glanced over at Whoopi. She had pushed him to the edge, and though he hadn't cracked, the weight of her words hung heavy in the room. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, not by anyone, let alone someone who had made her career by speaking her mind and calling out the powerful. But he was Trump, and he wasn't about to let anyone, not even Whoopi Goldberg, dictate how this ended. He looked into the camera, addressing the audience directly now, bypassing Whoopi's probing gaze. The audience leaned in, waiting for him to reclaim his narrative, to reassert the dominance he was known for. Let me make this clear, Trump said, his voice unwavering, each word carefully chosen. I've spent my life fighting for the American people. I've done things no one else has dared to do. And if you want to judge me by my personal life, if that's the litmus test you're using, then fine. But you should ask yourself, has he delivered on the promises he made? Has he made this country stronger? Because that's the only thing that should matter right now. Whoopi remained silent for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the air. She wasn't done yet. If anything, His deflection had only made her more determined to push him further. "I'm not here to judge your career or the economy you've built," she said slowly, her voice steady, almost too calm. "But people are starting to ask themselves, what kind of leader are you? The kind that makes bold decisions but lacks accountability? The kind who can win votes but can't seem to win trust?" Trump's eyes narrowed, his hands clenched on the armrests of his chair. It was like she had reached the core of him with that one. Accountability, trust. Two words he knew all too well, two concepts that had followed him from the moment he entered the political arena. They had been his enemies since day one. "I don't need to win anyone's trust, Whoopi," Trump shot back, his tone clipped. "I've won the trust of millions of people. And if you think trust is the only thing that matters, then you're completely missing the point. You want me to be perfect, but I'm not. I'm human. What I've done is what matters. I've created jobs. I've stood up for America on the global stage, and I've given the people what they asked for." Whoopi was about to respond when a sudden shift in the studio caught everyone's attention. The camera panned to the side, and the audience gasped as a well-dressed aide hurriedly entered the room, whispering something in Whoopi's ear. She nodded slightly, her lips pressed together in a thin line. The momentary distraction was enough to break the tension, giving Trump a brief reprieve. But it didn't last long. Whoopi turned back to the camera, her expression now somber, almost too calm. "Well, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice carrying a weight of finality, "we'll leave it up to the American people to decide. They'll decide if your actions and your words match up. But you can't hide from the truth forever." Trump's brow furrowed. He could feel the sharpness in her words, like a challenge, a direct confrontation that couldn't be ignored. He knew she was right. There was a truth here, one that was difficult to face, but he wasn't about to back down. "I'm not hiding from anything, Whoopi," he replied, his voice cold now, calculated. "I've faced bigger challenges than this, and I'll face whatever comes next. But I'll tell you this, I'll always put America first. And that's a truth no one can take away from me." Whoopi's lips twitched, almost as if she were ready to say something, but she held herself back. Instead, she sat back in her chair, her posture relaxed, giving the impression that she had made her point. The room, for the first time in what seemed like hours, fell silent. Trump glanced at the audience, then back at Whoopi. The challenge had been laid out. The stakes were higher now than they had been before. This was no longer just a debate over policy. This was a battle over trust, over legacy, over what it meant to lead. And while Whoopi might have had the last word for now, Trump knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cameras began to shift, capturing the final moments of the interview as Whoopi gave her final, polite nod to Trump. "We'll have to leave it there, Mr. Trump," she said with a forced smile. "But I'm sure we'll all be watching closely to see how this unfolds. Thank you for your time today." Trump stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he adjusted his suit. He gave a terse nod, his eyes never leaving Whoopi's. "Thank you," he said, the words almost dripping with irony. "I'm sure you'll be watching." And with that, he turned and strode out of the studio, his mind already racing ahead to the next fight. Because if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was that the battle for America's heart and mind wasn't over, and he was ready for whatever came next. The studio doors closed behind Trump with a soft thud, the hum of the cameras still lingering in the air. He could feel the eyes of the crew on him as he made his way down the hallway. The heat of the moment hadn't faded, if anything. It had only intensified. His mind churned, replaying the exchange over and over again. Whoopi's words, her relentless questioning, the slight digs at his character. But Trump wasn't a man to back down from a fight. He wasn't about to let the narrative slip away, not after everything he had fought for. The interview had ended, but the battle was far from over. Outside, reporters were already huddled around, their microphones at the ready. As Trump stepped into the waiting car, the flood of questions began, flashing lights, voices calling his name. But he didn't answer. He couldn't afford to give them the satisfaction. Not yet. Inside the car, the tension was palpable. His aides sat silently, their faces etched with concern. Trump could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to react, to say something, to lead them forward. "We need to control the narrative," one of them spoke up, breaking the silence. Trump nodded slowly. The interview had been a challenge, but it had also revealed something important. Whoopi's questions, her critiques, they were more than just attacks. They were a reflection of something deeper, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. "Get the press office ready," Trump said, his voice firm, his gaze fixed ahead. "It's time to turn this around. I won't let them define me. I won't let them take away what we've built." As the car sped down the road, Trump leaned back, his mind already plotting the next move. The fight for his legacy was just beginning. And with every step, every word, he would remind the world he wasn't going down without a fight. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Donald Trump was ready for whatever came next.